Thank you for joining us this evening for the first of our 3 high holiday dialogues with the faculty of the Hadar Institute. Throughout the month of Elul, a time of learning and introspection before the holidays, we'll discuss some of the major themes that we encounter over the course of the holidays and how we can integrate new meaning into our worship and our rituals. Tonight's program will focus on Hesed, or kindness, as a tenet of the high holidays. I'm honored to welcome our guest scholar, Rabbi Aviva Richmond. Rabbi, welcome to you. Rabbi Richmond is a Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar Institute and has been on the faculty since 2010. A graduate of Oberlin College, she studied in the Pardes Kollel and the Drisha Scholars Circle and was ordained by Rabbi Danny Landes. She completed a doctorate in Talmud at NYU. Welcome, Rabbi Richmond. It's a pleasure to be in dialogue, to join with you in dialogue this evening. As a reader of your Divrei Torah on the Hadar website, I can commend people. In fact, I just got one in my inbox for this week's Parsha as I was coming upstairs. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Park Avenue Synagogue and to be in dialogue with you here this evening.
Thank you.
So we're in the month of Elul, and as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a time for introspection. It's a time to prepare for the holidays, to do that cheshbon hanefesh, that inventory of the soul. It's also an opportunity to open this machzor that I brought with me and to reintroduce ourselves to the themes of these days, of these Yamim Noraim, these days of awe. Now, in our tradition, there are many attributes of God, and the one that we confront, I think, the most, or take center stage in this holiday season, is the attribute of kingship, of malchut. And I'd like to, as we begin here this evening, to try and unpack for a little bit this theme. And before we get to potentially people's struggles or reservations with encountering God as king or God as monarch, I'd like to just understand why there's so much talk about kingship in the machzor, in these themes, in these days of awe. And just to remind our audience before we open this up, there's several moments in the machzor where kingship takes that center stage. So we focus on this theme of malchut, and as we look in the machzor, we begin the shacharit service, the morning service, by invoking God as HaMelech. There is Avinu Malkeinu, which we recite on these days, our Father, our King. We have these paragraphs in the Amidah, what I'll call the 3 uvechains, where the middle one has this theme of kingship again. And of course, in Musaf, for these days of awe, we have these 3 additional sections, one of which is Malchuyot, verses around kingship. So this is a big theme on these holidays, and I would love to just hear from you, and we can talk about why so much focus on God as king in these days.
Great. Well, I was just say it's an honor to be here, and so often I think we spend our high holidays and time with the machzor in our own congregations and services wherever we are. It's just wonderful to get to be in conversation about this and about this theme. Well, first I'll ask a question that makes this question even stronger, which is, I think the predominance of God as Melech in our high holiday liturgy should capture our attention even more when we notice how much God is not called Melech in the Torah. So if you're just to show up to synagogue and hear the Torah being read week in, week out, you would barely ever use the word Melech to describe God. So there's something happening here that, I don't know if we can be certain what motivates it, but it sounds like we want to be able to relate to God in all of God's grandeur. We want to be able to relate to our world at this time of Rosh Hashanah, when we're thinking about the creation of the world. We want there to be a very clear creator who holds vision, who is in charge and making sure that the world is working as it should. So in some ways, I think that the predominance of Melech speaks to how much we really desire for there to be a Melech, and how much our rabbis sort of desired this, the splendor, the grandeur, the glory of a king. And some of it might also be in relation to the, if you think of the kind of Greco-Roman context, and the emperor at the time, who is in many ways kind of the inverse of how the rabbis think of God. Right? God represents justice, kindness, right? And we know that through depictions of the emperor that they may have known, who was sort of the flesh and blood king, but they really want to depict for us a God who is king in all of the ideal ways that we could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Torah, and as I was looking through some notes for this evening, I was struck by the lack of, language about God as king, and if anything, a reluctance in the Torah of kingship in general, right? That there's an accommodation that God makes for the Israelites to have a king, for example. That which is lost by kingship, that which is gained, right? Protection, a central monarchy. And yet we know that the Israelites will give up a great deal to have a king. So to turn to God as Melech, as you said, does capture the splendor. And I'm also struck by this image of Avinu Malkeinu, right? Our parent, our father, our king, right? Which in a sense captures, a lot of different attributes. Like we want the splendor, God creates the world, God is creator, and yet we also know that we want that intimacy of a parent on these days, right? As we confront our own limitations, our own immortality, our own imperfections, that sometimes we don't want that justice and judgment that a king will bring. We want the love and compassion and forgiveness that a parent will bring. And we see this intention all throughout the days.
Yeah, I think this is amazing to sort of give light to those two different sources of tension. The one being there's general skepticism towards kingship throughout the Bible, and we know that many kings abuse their power and it doesn't work out well. So I think that aversion to kingship in general in the Bible is one, it sits in tension, but in some ways also complements what we see in the Machzor, which is the ideal vision of the king, which only God as king could really be. And then the other tension that you're pointing to of how much we do want God as king, but also want this more intimate relationship with God. I think those are sort of beautiful contrasts to bring into this kingship language and symbolism.
Yeah, I mean, I'll throw one other thought before I want to think about the ways in which people may struggle to relate. As you mentioned, some of the history and living at a time when kingship may have been entirely natural for people to relate to their rulers. For those of us who live at a time when we don't have a king, right? How is it that we can connect to God as king when we may have negative connotations with kingship, right? Monarchy and what that might represent. It's just an interesting, when you sit with the Machzor before the holidays and really look through it, you recognize, as we've talked about, just how frequent that image and metaphor is used for God. So I'd love to think for a few minutes about the ways in which some of this language can be limiting, right? That there may be people who come to the Machzor and say, well, this just isn't a God that I can relate to, or this just isn't a God that I see living in the world. What are some of those, limitations beyond, and I'm not minimizing the gendered language of Melech, and certainly talk about that, but beyond that, just the idea of God as monarch and your experience and, speaking with people in your own life. I'm curious how that image resonates.
Yeah, right. I do think a lot of people, it makes them want to close the book. And it's very alienating in certain ways. We in America are in a country where sort of in the fabric of our being, in our DNA, We are anti-king. That's what we are.
That's right.
This whole republic is founded on taking down the king. Now, in some ways, I think that can work well with this idea of God as king, because it's God as king, maybe instead of human kingship, which will inevitably become corrupt. But I definitely think people find that language to be alienating in and of itself. And then also to the extent that people might resonate with this concept of a divine ruler and the splendor around that, then I often find people just think it's not true, right? They don't see it. They don't see this in the world. They don't see God acting in the ways that are described in the Machzor in the world. And so then it just becomes hard to relate to. Like, what is this? Is it some sort of fantasy? Is it archaic? I think that piece of it can also be very hard.
Yeah, it is really complimented. I think I look on my bookshelf and I think about the great Max Art's book, Justice and Mercy, right? And really capturing these two critical metaphors. And I do sometimes find it limiting to think of God as Melech, as king. But then there are also times when I find it incredibly meaningful and powerful, all throughout this holiday season. So I sort of, like many people, find myself just living in that tension and trying to make sense of it as I, re-engage with this sacred text from year to year. So I want to turn to a beautiful text that we discussed in a pre-meeting that can actually provide us with a really fascinating reread of this idea of God as king, the dominance of malchuyot, of kingship, in this liturgical setting. Before we turn to that text, I think that there are two things I need you to help us understand, right? Because they'll play a pivotal role in this text that we'll learn and you'll teach and we'll learn together. And I hope that people will take with them throughout the holidays. And maybe we can find a way to post this text on our website. If we were to podcast, I'd say we'll post it in the show notes. I've always wanted to say that, but we'll find a way to post this text. So first of all, I think there is a midrash from Breshit Rabbah that needs a little unpacking so people understand the language of the text that we actually want to look at. And then there's the author of this teaching, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who my sense is that is unknown to members of our community. And I would love if you could tell us a little bit about Rav Hutner, his writings, where, the context of his life that will, I think, give us some important context to his teaching. So
Great. Let's
start with the text in Breshit Rabbah, and then we'll turn to Rav Hutner.
Great. Okay, yes. And I will share, I think this story that we're going to talk about in the Midrash in Breshit, it in some ways is maybe well known, but not necessarily fully understood. So the teaching in this Midrash, which is a pretty early interpretation of Breshit Rabbah that the rabbis bring, it's the story of how Abraham came to know God, how Abraham, looks at the world around him and somehow in that world comes to see God.
Right. So just side note for our listeners, one of the things we don't know from the text of the Torah is why God chose Abraham. So a whole lot of midrash, rabbinic teachings will come to sort of give us the backstory of Abraham, and that's where we are. So go ahead.
Great. Okay. And so this is one of them. So the story goes that he's like a traveler who's wandering from place to place and suddenly sees a building. The language in the Hebrew is bira doleket, which in medieval sources came to be understood as an illuminated kind of castle, an illuminated fortress. And Maimonides really codifies this, that the story of how Abraham came to know God is sort of he saw the world aglow, said, how could it be that there's nobody behind all of this beauty, and that there's nobody behind the sun that rises and the world that functions in the way that it does, there must be a sort of clockmaker, so to speak. And it's kind of this design theory model of how he comes to know God. And because the world functions, there must be a God behind it who's sort of pulling the strings. But actually, there was this amazing article by Paul Mandel in the 90s, 1994, that was called The Call to Abraham Revisited. I think that's the title of this article, where what he exposes is that actually bira doleket could mean something very different. It could mean that this traveler sees a building that's on fire. And it might even be that it's not some sort of glorious building like a castle. It's actually something more like a tenement house. If you look at some of the kind of philology and different studies of the language there, it seems more like it's a multi-story tenement house type thing where people who were not as well off would live. And then what Abraham says is, it looks like this building has no manhig, that's the Hebrew. It has no leader. It's like, how could it be there's a building that's just burning on fire and nobody's putting out the fire? It must be that there's no leader. And then the owner of that building peeks out and says, I am the owner of the building. Ani bal habira. It's a little bit cryptic, exactly what this means in the story of Abraham, but it actually sounds like what it means is that the discovery of God comes from looking at the world around you and reaching the conclusion that the world is on fire, that there's all these problems that are not being addressed, and it looks like nobody's in charge. And somehow Abraham noticing that, being drawn towards it, maybe instead of just walking away, allows him to hear the owner of the building speak, right? To peek out and call to him. And there's one other little subtlety here, which is in the story, this traveler says, it looks like there's no manhig, there's no leader, which is actually something more like a superintendent, if we're thinking of a tenement house, right? You see a building on fire, you'd expect the super to come and put it out. And then in the story, he doesn't come to know the superintendent, he comes to know the landlord, the Baal Habira. And so part of the argument here is actually the way we come to know God is by becoming aware of God's absence in the world. Not that the world is working perfectly, not that we sense the grandeur of a king, but that it actually seems like there is no king. And then somehow our role in all of this in our relationship with God comes with us getting to understand that God needs people to do God's work, right? The landlord needs the superintendent to put out the fire. God calls to Abraham, and Abraham understands that he has a role in tending to the work of the world. So that's sort of a transformative way of understanding how Abraham came to know God.
Yeah, those are all three of those, right, are beautiful interpretations of this story, right? Which has resonance in other places in the Torah. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about, Moshe seeing the burning bush and, why, right, that Moshe is chosen because he has the sort of, spiritual attunement to notice something that's burning but not being consumed. And to the degree that, I can imagine that, especially in the sort of last way that you explained the story or taught this story, that perhaps Abraham wasn't the first person to walk by this burning structure, and that his ability to stop and, sort of contemplate those questions of, is it possible that this could be burning and there's no manhig, there's nobody responsible for it, it not only demonstrates his spiritual capabilities and attunement, but as you said, the willingness to say, as a result of this, I understand that God will be manifested in this world through my actions, which I know that we are ultimately going to get to. But it really does set up beautifully this teaching from Rav Hutner. So if you would take a moment and sort of introduce us to this great teacher of Torah that, as I said, I suspect that many people in our community have not encountered before.
Yes, I'm happy to. And just to reiterate, and we'll talk about this more, right, that this sort of potential of this midrash is that our relationship with God starts from not seeing God in the world. So hopefully that will connect to the opening that machzor and not seeing God in that way in our world. Rav Yitzchak Hutner, a 20th century scholar, he was born in 1906 in Warsaw. And I would think of him mostly as he represents the integration of a lot of different modes of study and wisdom, both Jewish and secular. So he grew up in Warsaw, which is right near the town of Ger, the small town of Ger. So he has this Ger Hasidim, has sort of a Hasidic side to him, and then also had his Lithuanian roots. So that kind of battle between the Hasidim and Miknaidim is kind of happening inside of him, his own being. But he pulls from both that more kind of spiritual insight of Hasidism and the more kind of rigorous study of the Lithuanian yeshiva. He studied philosophy at the University of Berlin and became colleagues with Rav Joseph Soloveitchik as well. So he has this whole kind of Western philosophy angle, has some of the Musar angle, so really the sort of self-discipline. And he eventually went to what was then Palestine and continued his learning and his teaching. And interestingly enough, one of the forms that he conveyed his knowledge was through essays on the holidays. So a lot of his sort of theological, philosophical commentaries are really centered around holidays as their kind of pivot point.
And he lived out his life in what was Palestine?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that introduction. So let's talk about this text from Rav Hutner about God and about Hesed, about compassion, kindness, righteousness, etc., which will sort of, I think lead us to that conversation. I love the way you just framed it before, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but this notion that it's the absence of God, right, that can fill the void of us. Then, you referenced the, whether it's the Birad Doleket, the burning building, that, you don't see any manhig, or a machzor that you open and you encounter language that seems foreign, complicated, language that I don't relate to. It's that absence that provides us with sacred opportunities to discover God. So with that in mind, let's talk about this text.
Great.
All right.
Okay, so I will share, I think the first thing I will say is that if you think about all the holidays, and you think of the theme of Melech, of Malchut on Rosh Hashanah, you might imagine that an attribute to be associated most with Rosh Hashanah would be justice or judgment. And actually, Rav Hutner puts his most extensive meditation on Chesed, on kindness. That's how he starts off his essays for Rosh Hashanah. So that, I think, in and of itself is a major statement. Just sometimes when you think about a text, there's the substance of the text, and then there's the organization of the text. So just the choice to put a collection of essays about Chesed for Rosh Hashanah, the first holiday of the year, and the holiday where we are enthroning God, right? He's sort of putting Chesed, our kindness, as a really core necessary tenet to have any kind of notion of God as king. So I'll share just a little bit of this text where he basically talks about how Abraham discovering God, which I will just say, right, is important on Rosh Hashanah because Rosh Hashanah is all about us having a sense of God as king. So it's almost like we are reliving Abraham's discovery of God each Rosh Hashanah. We're sort of going through our own process of discovery and recognizing God. So he says, it must have been that the only way that Abraham came to know God, B'sha'asha hikir Avraham et bor'o is this language in Hebrew, that idea that Abraham came to know or recognize God, he says, it must have been that it was through chesed. Bal korcho derech netiv hachesed avar. is his language in the Hebrew. The only way to come to know God is through chesed. And he sort of sets that up through a previous part of his essay, drawing on Kabbalah and other Hasidic works, which present the idea that God created the world through divine chesed, right? God's decision to share of God's goodness with an other, with humanity as an other, and all of life's creatures, right? That was inherently an act of chesed, God displaying some sort of loving kindness to humanity. That is the only way that our world exists, by virtue of divine chesed. That's the most fundamental divine attribute when we think of the creation of the world. And so he then posits that if humanity that was created through God's chesed has any hope of being in relationship with God, coming to know God, it must be that we got there by following back, kind of by tracing back this line of chesed that was used to create the world. Right, so his language there is V'oto kav hachesed hanimshach yashar mezecher kodsho yiparach el toch habriya, that line of chesed, it's very kind of visual imagery, that line of chesed that comes from God into creation to create the world. Oto avar Avraham Avinu bidarko chazara mitoch habriya el zecher kodsho. Avraham had to kind of trace back that line of chesed to find God. What does that mean exactly? I don't claim to fully understand, but I think the idea is, we sometimes think of two things about Abraham, both that he was kind of the first to discover God, and that he happened to display the attribute of loving kindness towards people, right? His open tent and inviting in the guests. And sometimes I think we have a kind of sequential understanding of that. By virtue of being in relationship with God, he came to understand that it was important to do chesed, and so he did chesed. And here I think Rav Hutner is kind of flipping the order here. He's saying there's no such thing as knowing God without already being someone who does chesed. So I think what he's describing is Abraham was a person who in his body and being enacted chesed and kindness in the world. That is actually how he came to know who God is. So that becomes primary.
It's really beautiful. And you used a phrase before you started with the actual text. You used a phrase, enthroning God, right? Which is not a phrase we've used yet, right? We've talked about kingship. We've talked about the multiple times that the Machzor will refer to God as king. But that's a different image, right? That we enthrone God. What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so I think, so in some ways this sounds very radical, right? Because it suggests that God is actually not king until we make God king. But it's also very ancient, right? The language in the Talmud that describes the three additional endless sections of the Musaf Amida on Rosh Hashanah, the language it uses is Kedesha Tamlichuni Aleichem, so that you can make me king over you. So it may sound kind of subversive if we think the kind of pious religious posture is that God is, was, and always will be king. And the idea here seems to be like, that actually doesn't just happen in and of itself. There's real, it's contingent. God's kingship and sovereignty are contingent on humanity and our desire and maybe our, ability, commitment to making God king.
Right. So just to sort of paraphrase that, God will only be enthroned through our acts of chesed. That's what I think Rav Hutner is doing here. That's the leap that Rav Hutner makes. So if Rav Hutner starts as, God is not king automatically, God becomes king when we make God king. How do we make God king? Actually, not just by standing in synagogue for 3 hours on Rosh Hashanah. That's not the whole story. The real story is God becomes king when we do acts of chesed. Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the rabbinic text in Sotah, about imitating God's attributes, right? Like we may not know God, but we know how God acts in the world. And this is almost more radical than that, right? Like this isn't just about imitating God. This is that, in a sense, I keep coming back to the word enthrone, right? But that there is, this is going to sound more radical than I mean it to sound, but there is no God unless there's Hesed. Is that what he's?
I think that's, yeah. So, and he has language that basically says that. He says, Beli midat chasdo shel hanivra, if the created beings, those of us who were created by God's chesed, if we who were created don't do chesed, ein makom labore is his language. Mm-hmm. There's actually no room for the creator in our world. And so, yes, he does sort of end up with that very strong point, which is if we don't do acts of kindness, we do not live in a world where God's presence is there. There is ke'ilu. It's as if there's no God. And yes, and I do think that makes the idea of imitatio Dei that we think of, like God does acts of chesed, and so we also must really shift that to, like Abraham looking at that building on fire, it's like we are actually the ones who do that divine work of chesed. And if we don't do it, it's actually not going to get done.
Right. Yeah, it's very powerful. And I want to talk about, what it means for us on these holidays. But first, I'm curious what so I'm listening to this notion that, no chesed, no God type of thing, right? So, or that, so what do we do with, the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, Gemilut, Chasadim, right? So Gemilut, Chasadim there, Chesed, it sort of stops being the one of the three pieces of the puzzle of what maintains the world to being the main piece of the puzzle, the critical piece. So what do we do with study of Torah and worship, Avodah, right? Or, obviously they play a significant role, and maybe it's that they lead us to Chesed, right? But what do you think happens there in that three-legged stool of what sustains the world, or, for lack of a better term, what sustains God, right?
That's kind of a beautiful way to phrase that. Yeah, so this is where I do think in this Rav Hutner piece, and why he puts this as Rosh Hashanah, is it's not like all the other attributes of God disappear, and it's not like all the other things that we need to do disappear. But to the extent that Rosh Hashanah is about creation, this becomes primary, right? Chesed becomes primary. Yeah. So it's, it's not that Torah and Avodah are not important. It's not that you shouldn't come to shul for 3 hours on Rosh Hashanah. That is obviously part of our commitment.
Right?
Yeah. But I think his point is, if that's not all through the lens of Chesed and through a foundation of Chesed, then it can't get anywhere. Yeah. So Chesed he really associates with creation, foundations, that then paves the way for all of the rest of the work to happen, and all the rest of the work does need to happen.
Yeah, as you said before, Hayom Harat Olam, right? This is the anniversary of the creation of the world, right? And through this reading, right, that flows through Chesed, that we find God or enthrone God through our actions. So what does this mean for us as we find ourselves in Elul, right? This period of introspection, trying to, right, reestablish perhaps our relationship with God, enthrone God. What might this teaching mean for us as we make our way towards these days of awe?
Right. This is, I think, what we have to think about every year, and it's not simple. But one of the ways that I think this can manifest in our own Elul and high holiday practice, sometimes when we get to the line, uteshuva, utefila, utzedaka, right? Those three ways to make the decree less harsh when we get to unatana toka. Mm-hmm. And we think of tzedakah as like, okay, that's sort of something we can do.
The easy one.
The easy one is like, I'll just put some money in the box. And then maybe maybe what's in store for me for this year won't be as bad. But I think there's a total shift in that kind of thinking. Number one, it's less individualized. We approach the high holiday season in a much less individualized way, right? The way we can do chesed and kind of orient ourselves towards an awareness of others' needs, right? If that becomes not just a nice extra thing we can do when we happen to be in an opportunity where that makes sense, but becomes the foundation of our religious lives, I think we can just be much more attuned to the people we are close to the people we might not be as close to, but in our community, and to people who might be much, much farther. Right? When we think of our relationship, our responsibility towards all of those people in our lives, our attunement to noticing which things are on fire, to use that from Abraham, right? That I think that just can become a very orienting kind of like a compass that's driving us, and that's not some sort of extra thing on the side. That's really foundational in how we think about our relationship to God.
I also like, I mean, this makes its way into other parts of Jewish theology, but in particular, at this time of year, I love the human agency here, right? Like, if you open this book and don't find what you're looking for when it comes to God, there is agency for you to, through the work of your hands, right, through all the opportunities for chesed, to encounter God, right? And it really does put, in the same way that it was up to Abraham to, notice this burning building, it really is up to us in a way to approach the holidays with a posture that we're taking responsibility for our own religious experience and our own spiritual lives, right? Yes, the language might be feel ancient, or maybe we don't always relate to kingship or monarchy, but struggle with it, right? Live with it, enthrone God through your actions, and perhaps it will be a different experience on these Yamim Noraim. And I like that. I like that we're in a sense, we're challenging our Balabatim. We're challenging our community members to take responsibility for their spiritual lives.
Yes, and I think what's kind of amazing about it is taking responsibility for our spiritual lives is the same as taking responsibility for our world. They sort of happen in tandem. And yes, I think instead of sort of pointing our finger at all of those things in the Mahzor that feel sometimes ridiculous when we look out at the world around us, evil should disappear forever. And the idea that everybody, the whole world should have some sort of knowledge of God, whatever that might mean. And I think in some ways what is powerful is that instead of kind of pointing our finger at what seems inaccurate in our texts, we end up kind of turning that finger around, pointing it at ourselves, and asking ourselves, well, what can we do in order to have that sense of God's presence that we want to have, that we might strive to have? Now, I think it can be overwhelming, obviously, like being near a building on fire can be overwhelming. So there's definitely that side of the human agency piece is really powerful, and then figuring out like, well, what's manageable this year might be the work of each year.
Look, it might be that, yes, it can be overwhelming, and we also have imagery, metaphors for God as parent, right? As nurturer, and we should feel comfortable moving back and forth between those metaphors for God that we encounter, on these days. It's a very powerful teaching, and I want to thank you for not just bringing it to my attention, because it will definitely become, our community will be hearing about this teaching on the holidays, but also to introduce our community to Rav Hutner and his beautiful teaching. And I want to thank you for really teaching it to us so beautifully. So I think we are going to begin to wrap up. Rabbi Richman, I want to thank you for being with us in this month of Elul as we all go through this sacred work of preparing for these holidays, and for helping us find God in the world through this story of Abraham, and really challenging us to incorporate Hesed into our lives. As you said, it's got the double advantage of not only is it good for us spiritually when we enthrone God through our actions, but of course it's also good for the world. And I don't need to tell you that we live in a world that is in need of some healing. So I hope for all of us it is a year of healing for you, Rabbi, and your family. It should be a year where you are all inscribed in the book of life for a good year, a year filled with blessing. So I want to thank you again for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. Thank everyone who has tuned in for this program. Please join us for the next one, airing Monday, September 19th, where Rabbi Eli Confer and Rabbi Kaufman will discuss the uniqueness of the High Holiday Liturgy. And we will conclude our series with Hadar. I want to thank Hadar again for your participation on Thursday, September 22nd, with Rabbi Scheiheld and Rabbi Cosgrove in conversation on the theology of the high holidays. Again, Rabbi Richmond, thank you for being our guest, and I want to thank everyone who has joined with us this evening for this wonderful program. Wishing you all a good night.
Thank you.